Welcome to Part 2 of the Battle of Brawner Farm. If you've not seen Part 1, I recommend that you watch it first, as it describes the events leading up to this particularly short but very bloody fight. A link will be in the description below as well as recommended reading. I will earn a small commission, at no cost to you, if you chose to purchase. And now Part 2 of the Battle of Brawner Farm. On August 28, 1862, at around 6 p.m., one of General McDowell's units, a division of 4 brigades under Rufus King, is marching eastward along the Warrenton Turnpike toward Centerville, where they were told Jackson was located. King's division included 1,900 men of Brigadier General John Gibbon's brigade. There were 4 regiments, the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana. Gibbon was a regular Army officer and had trained his volunteers in the ways of the regular Army, dressing them in the regular Army uniform of a long frock coat and a tall, broad-rimmed black hat, which would soon become their nom de guerre. Passing through the small hamlet of Gainesville, King's 4 brigades, around 8,000 troops total, were marching leisurely down the road and had almost reached the tiny village of Groveton. It was near dinner time, so the division stopped briefly to roast some fresh beef over campfires. They were completely unaware that Jackson and his 24,000 men are hidden in the woods barely 3/4 of a mile away on their left. Brigadier General John Hatch's brigade is first in line, followed by Gibbon's Westerners, then the brigades of Abner Doubleday and Marcina Patrick. About 6 p.m., some of King's men noted a single rider observing them from a ridge about 400 yards away to the north. Nobody paid much mind, thinking it was a solitary rebel cavalry scout. In actuality, it was Stonewall Jackson himself sizing up the Federal column. Jackson apparently made up his mind quickly because the Federals noted that the horsemen quickly rode off over the crest of the ridge and vanished. A few minutes later, a battery of cannons swung into the open north of the turnpike and began firing on the Federal column. After a few shots to judge the range, the Confederate battery began firing for effect, scattering the men on the turnpike. Hatch called up his artillery in response, but the rebels made it so hot that the Union artillerymen could not man their guns. A quarter-mile behind Hatch, John Gibbon rode forward to see what was happening and spotted another Confederate battery deploying north of a group of farm buildings, known locally as the Brawner Farm. When these new Confederate guns began firing on the 6th Wisconsin, Gibbon deployed his Battery B 4th U.S. Artillery to counter-battery the rebel cannon. Soon, a 3rd battery of Confederate guns are deployed near the Brawner House and begin shelling Doubleday's troops. As the Confederate artillery continued to pound the Federals, Gibbon and Doubleday moved their troops into the relative cover of the Brawner Woods, which extended from the road northward about 400 yards toward the Confederate guns around the farm itself. In the woods, Doubleday and Gibbon found each other and discussed what to do. Since Pope had said that Jackson was at Centerville, and since the guns did not appear to be supported by infantry, the artillery in front of them must be light horse artillery from J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry. Cavalry was no match for infantry, so it should be easy to drive the cannon away. Gibbon volunteered the 450 men of his experienced 2nd Wisconsin for the job. Following a lane through the Brawner Woods, the 2nd emerged into the open, formed lines of battle, and headed toward the rebel batteries. As they went forward, Sheldon Judson of the 2nd wrote later that, "An unusual sensation of impending ill pervaded my mind." What happened next justified Judson's ill omen. As they got within rifle range of the artillery, the Confederate guns limbered up and retreated north of the farm and out of sight. Taking their place was a line of Confederate infantry, the 5 regiments of the Stonewall Brigade, the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 27th, and 33rd Virginia regiments. This small brigade was 800 of Jackson's best fighters. Outnumbered almost 2 to 1, the 450 men of the 2nd Wisconsin stood their ground as the Virginians got closer. The 2nd Wisconsin waited until the Confederates were within 150 yards before firing. 450 bullets zipped toward and into the Stonewall Brigade, but the Confederates didn't respond until reaching a rail fence only 80 yards away and, screeching the rebel yell, lowered their pieces and fired. Men fell, but the 2nd stood firm and began trading fire with the rebels, but they couldn't hold for long without help. Seeing the 2nd Wisconsin's predicament, Gibbon told the 19th Indiana to take position to the left of the 2nd. These 2 Federal regiments now matched the Stonewall Brigade in strength, but Jackson had 3 times more men in the area than King had in his entire division. Jackson could have easily crushed Gibbon's men and then the rest of King's division, but inexplicably, for some 30 minutes no other rebels entered the fight, probably due to the wounding of Brigadier General William Taliaferro, the commander of the Stonewall Brigade's division. Finally, Jackson took personal charge and led part of another Confederate brigade, Lawton's, into line to the left of the Stonewall Brigade, extending the Confederate line beyond the right flank of the 2nd Wisconsin. In response, Gibbon brought up the 6th and 7th Wisconsin to counter Jackson's move, but the Confederate line was so long now that these two regiments had to position themselves several hundred yards beyond the 2nd's right flank in order to prevent the rebels from sweeping into the rear of the Union line. This left a dangerous gap of 250 yards between Gibbon's 3 regiments on the left and the 6th Wisconsin on the right. The sun was very low now, the sinking sun giving the billows of gun smoke a sickening reddish-orange hue, but the killing went on despite the gathering gloom, and the shooting escalated into a crescendo that few men on either side had experienced before. A Wisconsin soldier said, "It seemed as if the heavens was a furnace," and another remembered that the volleys of musketry sounded like the continuous ripping of heavy canvas. As visibility declined along with the sunlight, maneuvering the men became near impossible, so the men on both sides simply stood their ground and loaded and fired as quickly as possible. Jackson now fed more men into the battle, with Isaac Trimble's 4 regiments of Georgians, Carolinians, and Alabamians joining the fight on Lawton's left. Trimble's men, however, ran into the 6th Wisconsin, who were concealed in a swale in the ground. Trimble took a volley, but these veteran troops shook off the shock and fired back while giving the rebel yell. One of the soldiers of the 6th said, "That yell, there is nothing like it this side of the infernal region." Gibbon now had all his troops in the fight, but he needed more to fill the gap between the two halves of his brigade. Gibbon sent back pleas for help, but Hatch and Patrick did not respond. Unknown to Gibbon, the division commander, Rufus King, was an epileptic who had suffered a series of seizures and was unable to command the division. Each brigade was left to fight on their own. To his credit, Doubleday took the initiative and sent his 76th New York and 56th Pennsylvania to fill the gap in Gibbon's line. It was now almost completely dark. Unable to see all along a half-mile line, each side stood perhaps 50-60 yards of each other and fired at muzzle flashes. Isaac Trimble ordered his brigade to charge the Federal line, but the noise was so intense that only his 21st Georgia and 21st North Carolina regiments heard the command. They got to within 30 yards when the 6th Wisconsin and 56th Pennsylvania let loose a volley which mowed them down. The 21st Georgia lost over 76% of their number. In one company, only 5 of its 45 men were untouched. The decimated rebels retreated. As the Georgians and Carolinians fell back, the darkness, thankfully, brought the slaughter to an end. As the noise of gunfire slowly faded, the cries of the wounded began to replace sound of gunshots. A Wisconsin soldier wrote in his diary that the groans were the most pitiful sounds I ever heard. In the dark, King recovered enough to pull his battered division south to the safety of Pope and the rest of the Army of Virginia. Gibbon's losses were horrible. When he received the casualty figures that night, he bowed his head and wept for the 725 men killed, wounded, and missing. The 2nd Wisconsin alone lost 276 of the 450 engaged. The savagery of the rifle fire was so intense that 21 of the wounded were shot more than once. But his Gibbon's 4 regiments of largely untested troops had stood face to face against one of the toughest outfits the Confederates had. Jackson himself admitted that the Black Hat Brigade, a name bestowed by rebels who confronted them at Brawner Farm, had shown obstinate determination, high praise from the taciturn Jackson. The cost to the Stonewall Brigade was also terrible. They lost 340 out of 800 engaged. Some estimates place the cost of that 2-hour fight at Brawner Farm at 2,400, which would be 9% of all the casualties from the entire Battle of Second Manassas. Of all that were engaged, north and south, 1 of every 3 men were shot. In military terms, the battle at Brawner's Farm was a draw. Jackson had a chance to destroy King's division but mismanaged the fight and so squandered the opportunity. Strategically, however, his goal of drawing Pope into battle succeeded. Jackson pulled his 24,000 back to the safety of Stony Ridge and its unfinished railroad bed and waited for Lee's plan to unfold. The next day, August 29th, 1862, General Pope, having finally discovered Jackson's true location, arrived with the rest of his army and attempt to break Jackson's formidable line in this Second Battle of Manassas. The day after, Lee and Longstreet would arrive on the field with the other half of the army, and on August 30th, come the closest they ever would to destroying a Union army in the field, but that story is for another video. Epilogue. Although the Stonewall Brigade would continue to fight well after Brawner, the Stonewall Brigade was being bled into a shadow of its former self. The brigade had numbered 2,000 men when it was formed early in the war. At Brawner Farm, they numbered only 800. 21 months later, the proud Stonewall Brigade would be virtually annihilated at the Battle of Spotsylvania in May 1864, with only 200 men total in its 5 regiments. On May 14, 1864, the remnants of the brigade would be consolidated with other Virginia regiments, and the Stonewall Brigade was no more. It would be George McClellan himself would bestow the nickname Iron Brigade to Gibbon's Westerners at the Battle of South Mountain on September 14, 1862, a run-up to the Battle of Antietam, but it was at Brawner Farm that these Westerners were discovered to be a force to be reckoned with. The brigade would fight hard at Antietam, Gettysburg, and other battles until the end of the war. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video as well as Part 1, which describes the events leading to this first meeting of 2 legendary brigades of the Civil War.